Dr. Sanders is well known in Darwin, in the Northern Institute in CDU at Nauru, and through his many presentations. His background, for those who don't know it, is mainly political science, at least from his PhD, but has been applied to the domain of welfare policy and Aboriginal people, and it's a long series of publications and topic. He's not new to it. I wrote down, that's why I was looking at this, the title of the Nugget Combs presentation 3-4 years ago in Darwin here, which was Combs' Bastard Child, Troubled Life of the CDEP, which was obviously an account of a long period of history, as well as institutional changes linked with CDEP. And the new life of the new child is the topic today. And I was wondering, and I'll just leave you on that, whether or not this is still the same bastard child that's lost some limbs or something, or it's a new child together, or the metaphor, a sin, it's going by the way, and you really want to forget about that metaphor, but we're quite interested in a very important topic, as you would know. And please welcome Dr. Sanders, Research Fellow at paper.
Thanks, Pascal, and I will come back to that metaphor. The title of my talk today is Allusions to Chapter 8 in this paper monograph, which we'll come to later, about activities in centralised authority. I've been looking at the income support system, the social security system, and Indigenous people for over 30 years now, and one of the most interesting things in that space has been this thing called the Community Development Employment Projects, or CDEP scheme, which was developed in the late 1970s. And you can see that I've been writing about it for over many years, and you can see what Pascal said in his introduction, that my background is more of a political science and public administration background than, say, an economics background. The language that I use is the language of politics and public administration rather than the language of economics. I talk about things like bureaucratic politics and remote community politics. I talk about divides in social policy between work and welfare, those sorts of things. So that's the sort of language, and of course, yes, Coom's Bastard Child was my 2012 Nugget Coombs lecture, and it was written at a time when CDEP was coming to an end. So it was the trouble. My analysis was that CDEP was at that point in its death throes and under severe review. And I think the next generation of programs came fairly soon thereafter. So I've always been a great defender of CDEP. I've seen it as what I think of as appropriate adaptation of social security to the different socioeconomic circumstances of Indigenous Australians. Not just those in remote areas, but that's of course where it started back in the 70s, and it expanded out in the 80s to cover the whole of Australia. There were CDEP programs or projects all over Australia from the late 80s through the 90s. And just to outline the various aspects of it that I saw as good, appropriate adaptation. It was a wages-based program providing part-time employment to Indigenous communities. It was not direct, when it started, it was not directly linked, it was notionally linked to eligibility for unemployment payments. Okay, it was actually operating on the edge of the social security system. Over the years it got pulled in a bit closer to the social security system, and I tell that story in another chapter in this latest paper monograph about CDEP slowly being reframed as welfare from employment to welfare. So it's a wages-based program, provides part-time employment, And very importantly, it avoided accusations, it's developed in the late 1970s, it avoids accusations of under-award wage work through a policy of having requiring 15 hours per week of work, which came about in about 78, 79 through the unions pushing back a bit and saying, well, hang on a sec, if we're getting people to work for their unemployment payment equivalents, which is what they were, then is this a return to under-award wage work? Which you can imagine, pastoral industry, and that has just come out of that in the late 60s and early 70s. And so this was the sort of solution to that little problem, that you would only require people to work 15 hours per week for their unemployment payment equivalent, and generally that became 4 mornings per week. That, in practice, in various CDPs around the country, there's a little bit of variation in that, but basically this became sort of 4 mornings a week program. So that's one little conundrum that the CDP handled very well. And then the other thing that it did is it allowed for people to work more than 15 hours per week if there was work available, and to retain the income. So they had very generous top-up rules, extra income rules, without penalty of losing the basic entitlement payment and work of 15 hours. So CDPs could win contracts for various things, and they could employ their staff to do those things, and the money could be put into extra wages for the people. So, and that could give people extra hours of work and extra income. So these are all very good aspects of CDP and how it worked. And the other thing that it did is that it supported local Indigenous authority building and self-management. And two of the ways in which it did that, I mean, the whole thing does that, but two more of the ways in which it did that was that it had very broad definitions of work, and it also had a locally administered no work, no pay policy, which in my observation was used fairly sparingly. People used positive incentives like additional work and additional income much more than they used no work, no pay policy, but actually the two were slightly linked, because when CDP did operate its no work, no pay policy, the savings from that were allowed to be kept, and so could actually be used to pay others who did extra hours. But that was only one way of having savings to pay extra hours. So I've always been a great defender of CDP from its early days, and in many ways that doesn't make me very stand out, because in some sense I remember in the very first article I wrote at the end of completing a PhD, I ended by saying that there were some would-be critics of CDP who had sort of conceded that it was actually a pretty good arrangement. You know, there were critics around because at this stage, because this was the only work-for-the-dole type program in Australia. So there were accusations of discrimination made against CDP because whitefellas weren't being made to work for the dole back in the late 1970s and during the 1980s. That doesn't come until 1996. But generally people said, well, yeah, this is a good way of managing this policy conundrum. And the policy conundrum basically is that if you didn't have something like this, a large proportion of those of workforce age in remote Indigenous communities would end up on unemployment payments. There just not enough jobs to soak up the whole workforce. So this created a way of having most people in part-time employment rather than having them on unemployment payments. I think I've gone one too far, have I? Yeah. Okay. get rid of you. So, in some sense, I was dismayed, but not disengaged when there was the coming closure of CDP. The closure of CDP in urban and regional areas in 2007, that hiding behind Don there is 2007. And there was a move in 2009 to having new participants on New Start while on CDP rather than on wages. And then, so that there's this process of reframing CDP as welfare. So a really interesting process where CDP in the 70s and 80s and 90s is seen as an alternative to welfare, it's employment. And then through this process we start to get CDP reframed as part of the welfare system. And there is a sense in which it does become part of the welfare system through the 90s and into the 2000s. So one of the things that happened in the 90s was that there were accusations, when CDP moved into urban and regional areas, there were accusations that it was discriminatory, and there was a Race Discrimination Commissioner's report on it. And one of the ways that the Department of Social Security handled that, and Centralised handled that, was to give, and one of the accusations was that people weren't eligible for add-on social security entitlements, like rent assistance and the like. And one of the ways that the Department of Social Security and Centrelink handled that in the late 90s was to actually give people on CDP a customer reference number and to allow them to be eligible for add-on social security entitlements like rent assistance, and also pay them a $20 a fortnight supplement for working for their dole, because when general work for the dole came in, it had a $20 a week, $20 a fortnight supplement for working for your dole. So people sort of became part of the social security system from 97, 98, 99 onwards. So this is from here. This is the story of the 2000s, 2007, 8, 9. CDP's been recast as part of the welfare system, and it's sort of saying this is not working, and it's being closed down in urban and regional areas, and people are being moved on to New Start from 2009. Then in 2011-12, there's a review of what's called remote employment and participation services together. And by this stage, the other thing that's inhabited the landscape is Commonwealth employment programs that are much more individualised, and so this is the job network, and the job network was what they were called at that point, and this is very much individualised management of individual unemployed by the contracted providers of employment services. And so these two things this and CDP get reviewed together, and there's a process of the recommendations come out, but this is fragmented. Always be wary of that language. This is fragmented, uncoordinated, dangerous language, because you're about to see different things get put together. Okay, these are actually very different things, and through this language they get put together into one thing, which is this thing called the Remote Jobs and Communities Program. Now, one of the things that interested me is that these are actually two very different things. One is individualised state management of the unemployed. The other was very much a community-based work program. So as this was happening, I'm thinking to myself, so which one of these modes of operation will come out the other end? Like, there's two things that are very different going in here, into this review process, and they're being, this sacred language of integration and versus fragmentation is being used to create one thing. What will that one thing look like? Now, in some sense, that set up some interesting dynamics which sort of placed me in So this was the question: how would this new thing called RJCP work? Would it look like the old CDP with daily activities in groups, 4 mornings a week? Or would it look like these other things that had popped up in the employment services space in the previous decade, which was individualised case management, where the individual unemployed person had a monthly meeting with a case manager and they set up a participation plan. Okay, so would it be monthly appointments or would it be daily activities in groups? And I argued that that it was important to keep alive the idea of CDP's work habits and daily activities in this new program. I thought that was one of the more important things that was in CDP, and that this new program ought to have some of that in it. So in some sense I was a defender of daily activities in this new program. I'm not so much the way it's happened, I'm not a defender of it at all. But so my argument was that CDP, this was part of what was important about CDP. This thing, work habits, is the 4 mornings a week sort of turn up thing that CDP had, and the social thing that it had of doing it in groups and localised authority. But in fact, when this new program RJCP started in mid-2013, the arrangements for that program in fact encouraged the opposite. The basic contract funding model was you needed to get the providers, the contracted providers, needed to get the individual job seekers, that lovely language that's been invented over the last 20 years, signed up, and that got the money flowing. So to get the money flowing to the providers, the basic requirement was to enrol the job seeker, have the monthly appointment, set up the individual participation plan. Daily activities were still asked for, and the providers could get more money if they had daily activities, but it wasn't the most essential requirement to the dynamic of the contract. Having daily activities in the early days brought in more money for providers, but it also increased their risk. They didn't know whether they were going to get the return on the cost of putting on activities. And so that led to a sort of what I observed in the early days was that daily activities tended to, of 2013-14, tended to be a secondary thing to the monthly appointments and plans. No, I hit this. It wants to jump on to. Okay, I think that's, yep. So this is my account in this cable monograph of the Anmatjere CDPs, where I've done most of my field observations, and what this book basically covers up to the end of CDP and a little bit into the first year of RJCP. And so it's my account of observing the Anmatjere CDPs for about a decade, from mid-2004, 5, 6 through to 2013. And the cover photo from this book is one of mine taken at Marajunta in 2008, and that was suggesting the very localised nature of CDP and the informal nature of CDP, the sort of very colourful local office. And I've got some other photos which similarly suggest that localised informality of CDP in the Anmatjere region. This is the CDP boys concreting in a pit in a mechanic shed that they made their own. Okay, there's this is a mechanic's pit, and they've concreted in for safety reasons, and they've signed their names in the cement as they've done it. So you can see this sort of informality, creating signs about what CDP is, and in around this period. Here, by contrast, are some photos from 2014, 13-14, which suggests, as RJCP is coming in, which suggests a sort of a slightly more formalised sense of authority and program. I've lost my title up here, with photos suggesting greater formalisation and centralisation of RJCP. So just things that have been put up, and this new activity centre is in the centralised town of Tea Tree. So for those of you who know the Anmatjere area, the previous office was in Marajunta, which is a little community often known as 6 Mile, which is sort of 6 miles out of town. This was built in the last days of CDP, never used by CDP, but a centralising thing, bringing it into town. And I think I've got some others that suggest that sort of... So these are suggesting, again, they're suggesting that sort of, they're suggesting that CDP activities are struggling in 2000, as RJCP activities are struggling. So here, the office is actually closed, and I think these are actually supposed to be the 9th. So the RJCP office is closed, and you still have to call for your appointments, right? For your RJC appointments, and any questions you have to call in, because that's required to keep. But the activities is actually closed. And this is actually a picture. So when I visited this is October 2014, I visited for a week, and it was clear that activities were struggling, and we were hanging around that central activity centre in Tea Tree, and the activities organisers were sort of saying, oh, we're having trouble getting people to come into activities in town. And I said to them, well, you realise that under CDP the activities were out in the various communities, and there's a shed down at Marajunta that the men are very attached to. Why don't you see if you can get them to come to that shed? And this is actually the activities coordinators and myself the next day going down to the shed and opening up for the first time in 18 months that local shed. And sure enough, within 10 minutes of opening up, out emerge a group of men ready to do their morning activities in that basic pattern of the gates open, 8 o'clock in the morning, people walk from their houses to the public place, which is court work. And basically from that time on, there's been a sense that central office, that the activities are out in the communities, that central office in Tea Tree is for the monthly appointments. Okay, there's some activities go on there, but that's mainly the monthly. That's the office as opposed to the work activities place. So, what happens after that? So here we are. We've got through to 2014. RJCP is running. It's struggling with activities. It's driven by the monthly appointments. Of course, RJCP is, and that review process that we talked about at 11-12, that's Labor-Gillard government process, and the Abbott coalition government comes into power just literally a month or two after RJCP started. And then there's a process of the Abbott coalition government and Scullion putting their stamp on this new thing called RJCP. And part of them doing it is to reinvigorate the name, or to change the name to something. Scullion starts to talk about returning to something more like CDP, and so they get the new name, the Community Development Program. But you notice it doesn't have the E in it, and that's very appropriate because there is no E in this program. It is all done on income support and New Start. Okay, there's no one on wages anymore. There were people on wages still until July 2015, actually. There were, I think there's we were down to about 300 people left on wages from many thousands that had fallen away from 2009 on. But so when the Community Development Program starts in July 2015, there's no one in the program on employment anymore. They're all on income support, New Start. So this is purely a work-for-the-dole scheme. And because activities are struggling, the Abbott government's push is to increase the activity requirements. And so the activity requirements are increased to 25 hours per week over 5 days. And this is now seen as real work habits, you might say. So 4 mornings a week, 15 hours a week is seen as not good enough work habits, okay? And so we then get the push towards, so we're not getting activities 15 hours a week, so we'll try for 25 hours a week. Sounds a good thing to do. You might think you might try and get the 15 hours a week going better. Anyway, and of course, another thing that this leads to in time is accusations of under-reward work. Okay, so the unions have picked up on this in a way that they haven't picked up on it since 1978-79 when it was first being set up. And they're saying, hang on a sec, this is slave labour, this is under-reward work, you're getting people to work 25 hours for their New Start payments, which is roughly sort of $250 a week. So you're getting people to work for $10 an hour, and the basic award rate is $17, $18 an hour. So that's where the 15 hours had come from in the first place. And then the other aspect of this change to the Community Development Program is that the providers' funding has become linked to participant attendance. And so in the latter half of 2015, the funding was notionally linked to participant attendance at activities at a notional 75%, but now during 2016, funding for the providers is linked to actual attendance. And the major effect, it seems to me, of this is that there's been increased punitiveness and penalties in the program that were already evident and building up in RJCP. But they've skyrocketed under the Community Development Program in the last year. Now, here are some. Did I skip a slide? This is. No, it's 10. Okay. Now I'm thinking that I'm skipping slides and I'm not. So, okay, so here's some penalty information from. Thank you. But under both RJCP from mid-2013 to mid-2015, and then CDP after that from mid-2015. And this, I say, has been compiled by Lisa Folks, who's my PhD student working on this with me. Lisa's a very experienced employment services operative, came up through Job Futures and has come to Caper in the last 3 or 4 years and done a PhD with me on this stuff. And it's just compiled because penalties have been around in Social Security recipients since the mid-1990s. I did a monograph in 1999 on the extent of penalties on unemployment payment recipients, Indigenous unemployment payment recipients that had just started in the mid-1990s. And one of the consequences of that was that the welfare industry got onto the fact that the department had these, and they'd given them to us at CAPER, and so they put them out quarterly. They put out the penalty numbers quarterly. They're not put out in a particularly helpful way. You have to wade through them each quarter and put them together. So Lisa has compiled these into time series. Now you can see the penalties building up in RJCP and CDP to the extent that there's now more penalties in CDP. This is the changeover point. You see there's more penalties in CDP than there are in Job Services Australia and Job Active. Now that might not sound very much until I tell you that this represents 5% of the caseload. This is the other 95% of the caseload, okay, nationally, because this is the remote program, this is the non-remote program. 750,000 in here, 35,000 in there. That 35,000 now getting more penalties than that 750,000. And if you break down the penalties, there's basically two types of penalties going on here. There's penalties for no show, no pay. This is the no work, no pay policy that was locally administered, and I said you tended to be used fairly sparingly. In fact, is now centrally administered and is just being used all the time. Okay, and so once you've got 3 didn't turn up at your activities penalties in 6 months, you then go into it's 6, yeah, and you can get 3 in a week if you don't turn up. If you happen not to be around the community for a week, you can be in this space within 3 days, basically. And then you get a review which sends you possibly into serious penalty land, which is where you get an 8-week non-payment period. And here you can see the number of serious penalties in RJCP, CDP building up. They're about, the different scales here, they're about a fifth of them, but there's 5,000 penalties, serious penalties. So that's 5,000 people possibly out there not on pay for 8 weeks at a time in a group of 35,000. So you can see this is becoming, the daily activity requirement is becoming an opportunity for penalties and punitiveness. And it's building up fairly quickly and enormously, to the extent that it's various ways of putting it, different ways of sort of cutting the cake. Over 50% of penalties are now on CDP participants. That's penalties nationally, okay? And this has been documented fairly fully in 2 working papers that Lisa and I have done over the last year as the penalty figures have come out. Look, we've missed one. It has gone to it. So the other thing that's it's showing up, so this work that I did 15 years ago in this CAPER monograph 15 was comparing Indigenous and non-Indigenous penalty rates across the country. And so Indigenous identifiers among job seekers across the whole country constitute about 11% of the caseload. So that's you've got your virtually 85% of the people in remote areas are Indigenous, and that's 5% of the caseload. Then there's another sort of 6% of the caseload that's Indigenous in the non-remote areas. And when you do it this way as well, you can see the Indigenous penalties are now higher than the non-Indigenous penalties. So that 11% of the caseload is now getting more penalties than the rest of the caseload. Okay, and you can see that that's the pattern going back to March 2008. The Indigenous coming up, and of course as the RJCP and CDEP effects have come in, while the non-Indigenous penalties have been dropping, the Indigenous penalties have been staying the same and now going up. So it's when the Department of Social Security came to us in 1997 and said, we're worried, we can now see we can now identify our Indigenous clientele, because back in the 1980s they couldn't identify their Indigenous clientele. And they said, and we're handing up penalties to people, and we're worried because we can see in our data that the rate at which we're handing out penalties to Indigenous identifiers is 1.5 to 2 times as high as other people. And they were worried, and they said, can you help us understand this? And I said, yeah, okay, we can do this. And we spent 18 months running around trying to understand why the rate of penalties among Indigenous identifiers was 1.5 to 2 times as high. Now, it's 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 times as high. And when I ask, are you worried about that discrepancy? I get answers which suggest, go back to the individual level rather than the aggregate level. Okay? They say, oh well, if the individual job seeker does the right thing, they won't get a penalty. So there's not any discussion of the aggregate pattern going on as I see it. We're putting out the aggregate pattern from government sources, but it doesn't seem that it's worrying people in the same way that that aggregate pattern was worrying people back in 97, 98, and a much less discrepancy in the aggregate pattern. So my last slide. What do I say? I'll have to... so just a few final thoughts. So the CDP program, the Community Development Program, is all about working for income support, but nothing like CDP. It correctly does not have employment in its name. There's no employment in it. It's all about working for the dole. It's a highly centralised program of managing individual income support recipients. And it has no sense anymore of being an exercise in Indigenous community authority building or self-management. That's just gone, okay? So if, in terms of that struggle of those things, JSA and CDP, this is JSA for remote. This is individualised management of job seekers for remote areas. That's what it is. It's more punitive than enabling through its daily activities, and you recall that I was a defender of daily activities, and I said this is an important part of what CDP is, having these daily activities in teams, and we should be trying to keep that. But now, of course, having those daily activities in teams and having them attendance monitored, having them 5 days a week, 5 hours a day, has become a source of punitiveness. Okay? And it's not, I would say it's not worthy of its name even without employment in the program. It's not a community development program. It's an abuse of that term to say that this is a community development program. It's work for the dole in a very straightforward way. And I would say that it's an inappropriate adaptation of the income support social security system to the socio-economic circumstances of remote living Indigenous Australians, which takes us right back to the beginning, because it seemed to me that what really interested me about this was that there were some really deep conundrums about how you adapt the social security system to the socio-economic circumstances of remote living Indigenous Australians. It was not an easy task, and CDEP managed those conundrums very delicately and came up with something which had, sort of was sat comfortably on the horns of various dilemmas about what you could and couldn't do in this space. And here we are, we've sort of blown it away, and we've got a lovely inappropriate adaptation which is very punitive, not very enabling. And to come back to Nugget Coombs, I think he would rise from his grave in protest at the punitive, centralised authority and the lack of experimental policy imagination involved in this program, which was, I suppose that's revisiting my Nugget Coombs lecture 4 years on. So that's me, and I'm happy to hear other people's experiences and take comments.